1914. Sarajevo is sweltering. A man pulls a small, semi-automatic pistol from his pocket. He isn't a soldier. He's a 19-year-old student who has failed at almost everything in his life, except for what he is about to do in the next 5 seconds. He fires twice. He doesn't know it yet, but those 2 rhythmic cracks are the starting gun for the 20th century. They will erase 4 empires from the map, kill 20 million people, and redraw the borders of the world we live in today. This isn't just a murder. It is the moment the old world died and the modern world was born in blood. To understand the shot, you have to understand the heat inside the room. In 1914, Europe was a powder keg, a barrel of gunpowder just waiting for a spark. The continent was a web of secret alliances and ego-driven monarchs. On one side, you had the aging Austro-Hungarian Empire, a massive, crumbling giant trying to hold on to its many different ethnic territories. On the other side was Serbia, a young, fiery nation backed by the big brother of the East, Russia. The imperial pride. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He wasn't particularly well loved, not by his uncle, the emperor, and certainly not by the people he was set to rule, but he was a man of duty. Against the advice of his security detail, he decided to visit Sarajevo, a city simmering with anti-imperial hatred. The shadows in the cafe. While the Archduke prepared his finest military uniform, 7 young men were meeting in the dim light of Belgrade's coffee houses. They were members of the Black Hand, a shadowy nationalist group. They weren't professional assassins. They were radicals fueled by poetry, nationalism, and a desperate desire for freedom. Among them was Gavrilo Princip. He was thin, pale, and dying of tuberculosis. He felt he had nothing to lose and an entire world to gain. They were smuggled across the border with 6 bombs and 4 pistols. Their mission was simple. The Archduke enters Sarajevo, but he does not leave. The warning ignored. The air was thick with warnings. Serbian officials had dropped hints that a trip to Sarajevo on this specific day, St. Vitus Day, a sacred day for Serbian pride, was a suicide mission. But Ferdinand was stubborn. He wanted to show the world that his empire was strong. As the royal train puffed smoke into the Sarajevo station on that bright Sunday morning, the 7 assassins were already standing in the crowds, their hands trembling over the cold steel in their pockets. The stage was set for a disaster that no one, not even the killers, truly understood. The sun over Sarajevo was blinding. The Archduke's motorcade was a parade of open-top cars, a display of imperial confidence that in reality was a display of fatal arrogance. Franz Ferdinand sat in the 3rd car, his plumed hat waving to a crowd that was largely silent and hostile. Beside him sat his wife, Sophie. It was their wedding anniversary, a rare day where they were allowed to appear in public together, despite the strict royal protocols that usually kept her in the shadows. The first strike. The assassins were spread out along the Apel Quay, the main road running alongside the Miljacka River. Each man had a specific station. The first 2 assassins lost their nerve. As the motorcade passed, the heavy weight of the moment crushed their resolve. They stood frozen as the cars rolled by. But the 3rd man was different. He asked the policeman which car held the Archduke. The officer, thinking he was a curious citizen, pointed it out. Kavrinovich cracked his cyanide pill between his teeth, pulled the pin on a hand grenade, and hurled it toward the moving car. The miracle and the disaster. In a move of pure instinct, the Archduke saw the dark object flying through the air and threw up his arm. The grenade hit the folded-back roof of the convertible, bounced off, and rolled under the fourth car in the procession. Boom! The explosion shattered the air. Shrapnel tore through the following car, wounding a dozen bystanders and a dozen passengers. Dust and smoke choked the street. The motorcade accelerated, racing toward the city hall. Gavrilovich, believing he had succeeded, swallowed his cyanide and jumped into the river. But the river was only 4 inches deep in the summer heat, and the cyanide was old and expired. He didn't die. He simply vomited in the mud while an angry mob dragged him away. The death of the plan. Gavrilo Princip, standing further down the line, heard the blast. He saw the motorcade speed past him at 40 miles per hour, far too fast for a pistol shot. He assumed the mission had failed. The Archduke was safe inside the city hall, and the police were swarming the streets. Princip, dejected and hungry, walked away from the river. He headed towards a small delicatessen called Schiller's Deli on a side street. He bought a sandwich and sat on the curb, mourning the failure of his cause. The world had been saved by a lucky bounce. The fatal decision. Inside the city hall, the Archduke was livid. "I come here as a guest, and you people greet me with bombs?" he roared at the mayor. His advisors begged him to leave the city immediately via a different route, but Ferdinand insisted on visiting the hospital to see the officers wounded by the grenade. For safety, the plan was changed. The motorcade would stay on the wide main road, the Appel Quay, and avoid the narrow side streets of the Old Town. But no one told the drivers. As the cars sped back out, the lead driver took a sharp right turn into a narrow street, the exact route of the original plan. The governor, riding in the car with the Archduke, screamed, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." The driver slammed on the brakes. The heavy car hissed and groaned to a halt, its gears jamming as the driver tried to shift into reverse. The car stopped dead, exactly 5 feet away from a young man eating a sandwich outside Schiller's Deli. 5 feet from destiny. Gavrilo Princip looked up. He couldn't believe his eyes. Through the dust and the exhaust, he saw the double-headed eagle on the door of the car. He saw the green plumes of the Archduke's hat. The target he thought he had lost was now a sitting duck, trapped in a stalled car, right in front of him. Princip dropped his sandwich. He didn't think. He just reached for the .38 caliber Browning. The world held its breath. The driver was still struggling with the gear shift. The Archduke was looking the other way. Princip stepped on the running board of the car, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. In the sudden, eerie silence that followed, a thin veil of gray gun smoke drifted over the car. For a heartbeat, it looked as though nothing had happened. The Archduke remained sitting upright. His wife, Sophie, sat perfectly still. The driver finally found the gear, and the car lurched backward, away from the sidewalk where Gavrilo Princip was already being tackled by the crowd. But as the car gained speed, the horror began to reveal itself. "Sophie, stay alive!" A thin stream of blood began to trickle from the corner of the Archduke's mouth. Sophie, seeing the blood, screamed, "For heaven's sake, what has happened to you?" Then her body went limp. She collapsed onto her husband's knees. She hadn't fainted. The second bullet had ripped through the side of the car and severed her abdominal artery. She was bleeding out internally. The Archduke, despite a bullet having torn through his jugular vein, found the strength to lean over her. His plumed hat fell away, and his voice was a ragged, desperate whisper. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." The governor, riding in the front, grabbed the Archduke by the collar to keep him from falling over. "Are you in great pain, Your Highness?" he shouted. Ferdinand's eyes were glazing over. His voice was getting fainter, a rhythmic chant. "It is nothing. It is nothing. It is nothing." By the time they reached the governor's palace, the Archduke's green tunic was soaked a deep, dark crimson. Both were dead before the doctors could even open their bags. The first domino, the ultimatum. While the bodies were being prepared for their journey back to Vienna, the wires of Europe began to hum with electricity. This wasn't just a local crime, it was an international crisis. Austria-Hungary was humiliated and furious. They didn't just want the assassins, they wanted to crush the nation of Serbia, whom they blamed for arming the boys. But there was a problem: Russia. The Russian Tsar had promised to protect his Slavic brothers in Serbia. The Austrians turned to their own ally, Germany. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a decision that would haunt history. He gave Austria-Hungary a blank check. He told them, "Whatever you do to Serbia, Germany will stand behind you." It was the ultimate green light for war. The July Crisis. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia. It was designed to be rejected. It demanded that Austrian officials be allowed to enter Serbia and run their own investigation, a total violation of Serbian sovereignty. Serbia, surprisingly, agreed to almost every point, but almost wasn't enough for the war-hungry generals in Vienna. July 28th, exactly a month after the shots were fired, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. July 29th, Russia began to mobilize its massive steamroller of an army to protect Serbia. August 1st, Germany, seeing Russia move, declared war on Russia. The trap snaps shut. The continent was locked into a series of mobilization timetables. In 1914, moving an army meant trains. Millions of men, horses, and cannons were being loaded onto rail cars. Once those trains started moving, the generals claimed they couldn't be stopped without leaving their countries defenseless. Germany's plan to win the war required them to knock out France first. To get to France, they had to march through Belgium, a neutral country. The moment German boots touched Belgian soil, the final superpower was dragged into the light. Great Britain, which had a treaty to protect Belgium, sent an ultimatum to Berlin. The Kaiser ignored it. On the night of August 4th, the lights went out across London. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, looked out his window and famously remarked, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The single bullet from a 19-year-old's pistol had successfully triggered a mechanical trap that was now dragging 65 million soldiers into the abyss. By the autumn of 1914, the romantic vision of war, cavalry charges, bright uniforms, and a quick return home before the leaves fall, had vanished. The continent didn't just go to war, it went into the earth. The German advance towards Paris was halted at the Battle of the Marne. Exhausted and battered, both sides began to dig. What started as temporary foxholes evolved into a 450-mile scar of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This was the Western Front, a stagnant wasteland where life expectancy was sometimes measured in hours. The industrialization of death. This wasn't the warfare the world remembered. For the first time, the full might of the Industrial Revolution was turned towards the destruction of the human body. The machine gun, a single weapon, could now do the work of 80 riflemen. It turned glorious charges into mass executions. The artillery. Heavy guns fired shells the size of trash cans from miles away. The earth shook so violently that men suffered from shell shock, a psychological breaking point never seen on this scale. Chemical warfare.
In 1915, a yellow-green cloud of chlorine gas drifted across the fields of Ypres. Men watched in horror as their comrades coughed up their own lungs. It was a new, invisible terror. The void of no man's land. Between the two sets of trenches lay no man's land, a nightmare landscape of tangled barbed wire, deep craters filled with rotting water, and the remains of those who had tried to cross. To go over the top meant climbing out of the safety of the mud and running directly into a wall of lead. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, the British Army lost 60,000 men in a single day. To put that in perspective for a U.S. audience, that is more than the total American casualties in the entire Vietnam War, occurring in just 24 hours. The home front and the total war. Back in the cities, the continent was transforming. With the men at the front, women flooded into the factories to build the shells that would kill other women's husbands. Food was rationed. Governments took control of every aspect of life. The war was no longer just between armies, it was between entire societies. The goal was to outproduce, outstarve, and outrast the enemy. In the East, the Russian Empire was beginning to crack under the pressure. Hunger and defeat were radicalizing the population. The shot in Sarajevo hadn't just killed an archduke, it had slowly poisoned the very foundations of the great powers. The entry of the giant. For 3 years, the United States watched from across the Atlantic. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on the promise to keep us out of the war, but the ocean was no longer a shield. German U-boats began sinking merchant ships, including the Lusitania, killing American civilians. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to Mexico, suggesting they attack the U.S. to reclaim Texas and Arizona. In April 1917, the New World finally stepped in to save the Old World. The arrival of 2 million fresh American doughboys provided the industrial and human muscle that the exhausted Allies desperately needed. The tide was finally turning, but the continent being fought over was already unrecognizable.
It hadn't just exploded, it had leveled the house. The continent was a graveyard of dreams. The invincible empires that had ruled for centuries were not just losing the war, they were vanishing from the face of the earth. The collapse of the East. The first to fall was Russia. The strain of the war had been too much. In 1917, the Russian Revolution erupted. The Tsar was toppled, and a new radical ideology called communism took hold under Vladimir Lenin. Russia dropped out of the war, but it left behind a vacuum of chaos and a civil war that would claim millions more lives. The Eastern Front was gone, replaced by a red shadow that would loom over the continent for the next 70 years. The 100 Days Offensive. In the West, the German army made one final desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive. They threw everything they had left at the Allied lines, hoping to win before the full weight of the American military arrived. They got close enough to hear the bells of Paris, but they ran out of steam. The German soldiers were starving, disillusioned, and facing a fresh, well-equipped American force that seemed endless. Then came the 100 Days. The Allies pushed back, breaking the Hindenburg Line. The German military machine, once the finest in the world, simply shattered. Back in Germany, sailors mutinied and workers went on strike. The Kaiser, the man who had given the blank check 4 years earlier, abdicated his throne and fled to the Netherlands in the middle of the night. 11 a.m. The silence. On November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in a French forest, an armistice was signed. At 11 a.m., the guns that had been roaring for 1,561 days went silent. Soldiers on both sides climbed out of their trenches, not to fight, but to breathe. Some shook hands, Most simply sat in the mud and cried. The war was over, but the peace would be far more dangerous. The ghost of Versailles. In 1919, the Big Four leaders, including U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, met at the Palace of Versailles to redraw the map of the world. They sat in the Hall of Mirrors, the same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed decades earlier. The map of the continent was shredded and taped back together. Austria-Hungary, the empire Franz Ferdinand was supposed to inherit, was literally deleted. It was carved into new nations: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, and a tiny, weakened Austria. Germany was forced to accept total war guilt. They were stripped of their colonies, their army was gutted, and they were slapped with a debt so massive it would take them until 2010 to pay it off. The legacy of the shot. As the diplomats signed the treaty, a French general named Ferdinand Foch looked at the document and whispered a terrifying prophecy. "This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years." He was right. The shot fired by Gavrilo Princip in 1914 had done more than kill a prince. It had destroyed the old balance of power and left behind a wounded, angry Germany, a radicalized Russia, and a Middle East carved up by British and French lines that still cause conflict today. Gavrilo Princip himself never saw the end of the war. He died in a dark prison cell in April 1918, just months before the armistice. He died of tuberculosis, the same disease that had made him feel he had nothing to lose on that hot June day in Sarajevo. He had wanted to free his people. Instead, he had accidentally set the entire world on fire. The shot that changed a continent didn't just end with the treaty. It echoed through the rise of Hitler, the horrors of World War II, and the Cold War. Even today, when you look at a map of Europe or the Middle East, you are looking at the smoke rings from a 19-year-old's pistol. The war was over, but the shot was still echoing. For the United States, the 1920s were a roaring decade of jazz and skyscrapers, but for the continent of Europe, the 1920s were a slow-motion car crash. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological scars were festering into something much darker. The death of certainty. Before 1914, Europeans believed in progress. They believed that science, technology, and monarchy would lead to a golden age. The trenches destroyed that belief. A whole generation of young men, the poets, the scientists, and the leaders of the future, had been turned into missing names on village memorials. This became known as the Lost Generation. They returned home to a continent that felt empty and meaningless. In the cafes of Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, a new feeling took hold: nihilism. If a single bullet could destroy the world, then nothing mattered. This despair created a vacuum, and history teaches us that whenever there is a vacuum of hope, a strong man will rise to fill it. The Red Scare and the Black Shirts. In the East, the Russian Revolution hadn't stayed in Russia. Communism was spreading like a fever. For the middle classes of Europe, the fear of a red wave was terrifying. In Italy, a former journalist named Benito Mussolini saw his opportunity. He realized that the veterans of the war, men who were trained to kill and felt betrayed by the peace treaties, were a political weapon. He dressed them in black shirts and promised to restore the glory of Rome. This was the birth of fascism. He was the first to realize that in the post-war world, emotion and violence mattered more than truth or law. The Germans' stab in the back. Nowhere was the shot more toxic than in Germany. The German people had been told they were winning the war until the very moment they lost it. When they looked at the Treaty of Versailles, which blamed them for everything, they didn't see justice, they saw a crime. A conspiracy theory began to spread, the Dolchstoßlegende, or the stab in the back myth.
The idea was that the brave German army hadn't been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed at home by Jews, socialists, and politicians. In a crowded beer hall in Munich, a veteran with a Charlie Chaplin mustache began to speak. His name was Adolf Hitler. He wasn't a genius, he was a symptom of the wound Gavrilo Princip had opened. He told the German people they were victims. He told them that the shot in Sarajevo was the start of a global plot to destroy them. And for a people who had lost everything, his lies sounded like music. The Great Depression, the final spark. The world might have recovered if not for the autumn of 1929. The U.S. stock market crashed, and the loans that were keeping Europe's heart beating were suddenly pulled back. In Germany, unemployment skyrocketed to 30%. People were burning their paper money just to keep their houses warm. The moderate government collapsed. In the 1932 elections, the desperate people turned to the extremes. The shot that changed a continent had led to the war, the treaty to the crash, and the crash to the Nazis. The ghost of the Archduke. By 1933, Hitler was in power. The borders that were drawn in 1919, the nations of Czechoslovakia and Poland, were now in his sights. He viewed them as artificial creations of the Sarajevo aftermath. The world was walking back into the same trap. The alliances were reforming. The factories were starting to build tanks instead of cars. The peace for our time was an illusion. The 20th century was only 20 years old, and it was already preparing for an encore that would be even more devastating than the first act.
The sound of that shot didn't stop at the borders of Europe. It traveled across oceans, through deserts, and over the Himalayas. For a U.S. audience, it's vital to see that the shot that changed a continent actually set the entire planet on a new trajectory. The death of the Old East. Before the shot, China was a struggling republic trying to find its footing after thousands of years of imperial rule. When the war broke out in 1914, Japan, allied with Britain, seized German territories in China. At the end of the war, the Chinese expected to get their land back. Instead, the Western powers at Versailles gave that land to Japan. This betrayal sparked the May 4th movement in Beijing. Students took to the streets, abandoning Western-style democracy and looking toward a new, radical ideology rising in Russia, communism. Without the bitterness caused by the Sarajevo aftermath, the Chinese Communist Party might never have gained the momentum that eventually led to the rise of Mao Zedong. The lines in the sand, the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, centered in modern-day Turkey, had ruled the Middle East for 400 years. When they chose the wrong side, Germany, following the assassination, they signed their own death warrant. In secret rooms in London and Paris, two diplomats named Sykes and Picot sat down with a map and a ruler. They drew straight lines through the desert, creating new countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. They didn't care about ethnic tribes or religious history. They only cared about oil and influence. These artificial borders are the direct reason for the conflicts we see on the news today. Every war in the Middle East over the last century can be traced back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, a collapse triggered by a teenager's bullet in Bosnia. The awakening of Africa and India. The Great War required millions of soldiers. Britain and France didn't have enough men, so they turned to their colonies. Over 1 million Indians and hundreds of thousands of Africans were shipped to the trenches of France. For the first time, these colonized people saw the invincible Europeans bleeding and dying in the mud. They saw that the white man was not a god. They learned how to use modern weapons and how to organize military units. When the survivors returned home to Mumbai, Nairobi, and Dakar, they didn't return as subjects, they returned as nationalists.
The shot in Sarajevo was the starting gun for the decolonization movement that would eventually dismantle the British and French empires. The U.S. from debtor to giant. Perhaps the most dramatic shift was economic. In 1914, the U.S. was a debtor nation, owing billions to European banks. By 1918, the roles had reversed. Europe had spent its entire gold reserve on shells and blood. The U.S. became the world's banker. The U.S. dollar began its journey to becoming the global reserve currency, replacing the British pound. The American century didn't happen by accident. It happened because the old powers of the world committed suicide in a war they couldn't afford, sparked by a murder they couldn't prevent. The irony of freedom. Gavrilo Princip believed he was a liberator. He wanted a world where small nations could be free from big empires. In a strange, twisted way, he got his wish, but at a price no one would have willingly paid. He broke the old world, but the pieces that grew back were sharper, more violent, and far more complicated. The continent was changed, yes, but the world was re-engineered. From the rise of the red dragon in the east to the oil-soaked sands of the Middle East, we are all living in the blast radius of a 1910 Browning pistol. If you could travel back to June 28, 1914, and tell Gavrilo Princip that his 2 shots would eventually lead to the invention of the nuclear bomb, the moon landing, and the internet, he would have thought you were a madman. But history isn't a straight line. It's a series of ripples. And today, more than a century later, we are still swimming in those ripples. The return to the scene of the crime. To understand the modern legacy of the shot, we have to look at Sarajevo in the 1990s. In an irony that history seems to love, the city became a slaughterhouse once again. When the Cold War ended, the country of Yugoslavia, the greater Serbia that Princip had dreamed of, began to tear itself apart. The ethnic tensions that the Archduke had tried to manage and that the world wars had suppressed exploded. For nearly 4 years, Sarajevo was under siege. Snipers sat in the same hills where the assassins had hidden, and the world watched on live television as the powder keg ignited one more time. It was a haunting reminder that the ghosts of 1914 had never truly been laid to rest. The blueprint of modern terror. For a U.S. audience, the Sarajevo assassination provided
The spark. 1939 was the house burning down to its foundations. To a U.S. audience, World War II is often seen as a separate, heroic struggle between good and evil. But to a historian, it is simply the Great War Part II. The unfinished business of that sunny afternoon in Sarajevo was finally coming due, and the cost would be paid in the lives of 60 million people. The death of the buffer states. When Gavrilo Princip fired his pistol, he wanted to create a greater Serbia, Yugoslavia. When the victors of World War I sat at Versailles, they created a series of new countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia to act as buffers between the giants of Germany and Russia. By 1938, Hitler began dismantling these countries piece by piece. He argued that the borders drawn after the Sarajevo crisis were illegal. When he marched into the Sudetenland and later invaded Poland, he wasn't just conquering land, he was systematically erasing every trace of the 1919 peace treaty. He was trying to undo the humiliation that began with the Archduke's death. The return of the two-front nightmare. The German generals of 1914 had one great fear, fighting France in the west and Russia in the east at the same time. This fear is what triggered their invasion of Belgium and dragged Britain into the war. In 1939, Hitler thought he had solved the puzzle. He signed a devil's pact with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. These two ideological enemies, born from the chaos of the First War, shook hands to divide Europe between them. But the shot still had one more irony to deliver. Just as the alliances of 1914 dragged everyone into a hole, Hitler's betrayal of Stalin in 1941 created the very two-front war that destroyed the German Empire for the second and final time. The American Colossus. In the First War, the United States arrived late and helped tip the scales. In the Second War, the shot in Sarajevo finally forced America to abandon its isolationism forever. The U.S. didn't just send troops, it became the arsenal of democracy. By 1944, American industrial might, fueled by the lessons learned in 1917, was producing a plane every 5 minutes and a ship every day. The center of gravity of the entire world was shifting. The continent, Europe, was no longer the master of the globe. It was now a battlefield where two new superpowers, the U.S. and the USSR, would meet to decide the future. The final tally, 1945. As the smoke cleared over a ruined Berlin in May 1945, the world Gavrilo Princip knew was gone. The cities, London, Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw, were in craters. The map, the Greater Serbia Princip dreamed of, was now a communist state under Marshal Tito. The power, for the first time in 1,000 years, Europe was no longer the center of the world. It was divided by an Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill, the same man who had been in charge of the British Navy when the first shots were fired in 1914. Shutterstock. The 100-year echo. We often think of history as the past, but the shot in Sarajevo is still moving. In the 1990s, the country of Yugoslavia, the very country Princip died to help create, collapsed into a series of brutal ethnic wars. The site of the assassination, Sarajevo, was placed under the longest siege in modern military history. Sniper fire once again echoed through the same streets where the Archduke's car had stalled. Even today, the tension between Russia and the West over borders in Eastern Europe is a direct descendant of the collapse of the empires in 1914. We are still living in the long 20th century. Conclusion: the ghost in the street. If you visit Sarajevo today, there is a small plaque on the corner where Schiller's Deli once stood. It marks the spot where a 19-year-old stood with a pistol. The story of the shop that changed a continent is a warning. It tells us that history isn't just made by presidents and kings in marble halls. It is made by wrong turns, stalled engines, and desperate people in the street. A single moment of violence can start a fire that burns for a century, crossing oceans and toppling giants. The Archduke's blood on his green tunic was the first drop in an ocean of red. We remember the names of the battles, the Somme, Normandy, Stalingrad, but they all began with two rhythmic cracks from a Browning .38 on a sweltering Sunday morning. The world we live in is the shadow of that bullet. To the world, Gavrilo Princip was a lone gunman, but history is rarely that simple. If you pull back the curtain on the Sarajevo assassination, you find a web of conspiracy that looks like a modern-day spy thriller. This wasn't just a disgruntled kid. This was a state-sponsored hit that spiraled out of control. The architect, Apis. Behind the 7 teenagers in Sarajevo stood a man known only by his code name, Apis, the Bee. His real name was Degratin Dmitrievich, the head of Serbian military intelligence. Apis was a terrifying figure. Years earlier, he had led a coup where he broke into the Serbian royal palace, murdered the king and queen, and threw their bodies out of a window. He was the leader of the Black Hand, a secret society whose motto was unification or death. Apis didn't just give the assassins guns, he gave them cyanide. He didn't want them to be caught and talk. He wanted them to kill the Archduke
and then disappear into the grave. But Apis made a fatal mistake. He underestimated the resolve of a 19-year-old dying. The 4 times the world almost didn't change. When you look at the timeline of luck on June 28th, it's haunting how many times the universe tried to save Franz Ferdinand. The missed bomb. As we saw, the first grenade bounced off the car. If it had landed 2 inches to the left, the Archduke would have died instantly, but the motorcade would have sped away, and the wrong turn later in the day never would have happened. The failed cyanide. After the bombing, Chabrinovich swallowed his cyanide and jumped into the river. If the poison had worked, he would have died. The police would have assumed he was a lone wolf, and they likely would have canceled the rest of the parade. Instead, his survival alerted the police that a larger conspiracy was at play. The security gap. The Archduke's personal bodyguard, Count Harrach, was supposed to be standing on the running board of the car to shield him, but after the bomb went off, the Archduke told him to sit inside because it looked more dignified. If Harrach had stayed on the outside, he would have taken the bullet meant for the prince. The unfolding engine. The car Principe approached wasn't just stopped, it was a state-of-the-art 1910 Graf and Stift. These cars were notoriously difficult to shift into reverse. If the gears hadn't jammed at that exact 3-second window, the car would have pulled away before Principe could aim. The curse of the car. For those who believe in the supernatural, the story of the shot has a darker side. The car the Archduke died in is often called the cursed car of Sarajevo. After the war, the car went through 15 different owners. It was involved in 6 accidents and caused the deaths of 13 people. One owner, a Yugoslavian governor, had 4 accidents in it and lost his left arm. Another, a Swiss racing driver, was thrown from the car and killed. Today, the car sits in a museum in Vienna, its blood-stained leather seats a silent witness to the moment it carried the world into the abyss. The confession of a dying man. While the war was raging in 1917, the Serbian government decided Apis was too dangerous to keep alive. They put him on trial for treason. Just before he was executed by a firing squad, he reportedly whispered that he never expected the assassination to start a world war. He thought it would just be a local shakeup. This is the ultimate lesson of the shot in Sarajevo. No one is in control. Not the spies, not the generals, and certainly not the politicians. They all thought they could use a single act of violence to achieve a small goal. Instead, they released a demon that they couldn't put back in the bottle.
People lived and died within 20 miles of their birthplace. Their worldview was shaped by their local priest, their neighbors, and perhaps a weekly newspaper. But the shot changed that forever. To keep millions of men marching into machine gun fire, governments realized they didn't just need bullets, they needed to control truth itself. The British masterclass in deception. When the war started, Great Britain did something radical. They didn't just send troops, they created the Wellington House, a secret department dedicated to information research. Their goal? To convince the United States to join the war. They cut the underwater telegraph cables connecting Germany to America, ensuring that every piece of news reaching the U.S. had to pass through London first. They invented stories of German corpse factories and horrific atrocities that were often exaggerated or entirely fabricated. They realized that in the modern world, whoever tells the story first wins the war. The Committee on Public Information, CPI. When the U.S. finally entered the war, President Woodrow Wilson took the British model and supercharged it. He created the CPI, the first massive state-controlled propaganda agency in American history. They hired 75,000 four-minute men,
volunteers who gave short patriotic speeches in movie theaters, churches, and town squares. They transformed the American public from a neutral, peaceful population into a war-hungry machine in less than a year. This was the birth of modern public relations, PR. In fact, the man often called the father of PR, Edward Bernays, got his start working for the U.S. government during World War I. He later said, "If you can use propaganda for war, you can certainly use it for peace, and for selling cigarettes." The censorship and the secret police. The shot in Sarajevo didn't just kill the Archduke, it killed free speech across the West. In the U.S., the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed, making it a crime to speak out against the war. In Germany and Russia, the secret police became the primary tool of the state. For the first time, governments were opening people's mail, listening to their phone calls, and monitoring their movements. The total war required a total state. The surveillance systems we debate today, government monitoring and data collection, have their DNA in the emergency measures taken in 1914 to protect the home front. The radicalization of the truth. Because the war lasted so long and cost so much, governments couldn't admit they were fighting for simple territory or royal ego. They had to frame it as a holy war. To the British, it was the war to end all wars. To the Germans, it was a defensive struggle for culture. To the Americans, it was making the world safe for democracy. When the war ended and the soldiers returned to find that the world was not safe for democracy and that the war had not ended all wars, the disillusionment was total. This led to a massive truth crisis. If the government lied about the war, what else were they lying about? This cynicism is what allowed radical groups like the Nazis and the Bolsheviks to claim that the mainstream news was fake and that only they had the real truth. The lasting scar, the death of nuance. Before Sarajevo, the world was gray. After Sarajevo, the world became black and white. You were either a patriot or a traitor. You were either a Hun or a hero. This binary thinking is perhaps the most tragic legacy of the shot. It destroyed the ability of nations to talk to one another. It replaced diplomacy with shouting and compromise with total victory. When you see the polarized, high-tension political landscape of the 21st century, you are looking at a world that is still using the propaganda tools invented in 1914. The bullet in Sarajevo didn't just pierce the Archduke, it pierced the very idea of an objective, shared reality. If Gavrilo Princip had walked through a military camp in 1914, he would have seen thousands of horses, men in colorful cloth tunics, and officers carrying swords. It was a scene that would have looked familiar to Napoleon or even Caesar, but because of the shot, the world underwent 500 years of technological evolution in just 4 years. The war that followed the assassination didn't just use machines, it turned the world into a machine. The death of the horse. For thousands of years, the horse was the king of the battlefield. In the first weeks of the war, the French cavalry rode out in bright blue coats and red trousers, lances held high. They were mown down in seconds by the cold, mechanical rhythm of the Maxim machine gun. The shot forced humanity to find a replacement for the animal. In the mud of 1916, a secret British project developed a land ship designed to crush barbed wire and cross trenches. To keep the project secret, they told workers they were building mobile water containers. They called them tanks. The moment the first tank roared into battle at the Somme, the 4,000-year era of the mounted warrior was over. The age of the engine began. The conquest of the sky. In 1914, airplanes were flimsy toys made of wood and canvas, used only for scouting. But the desperation of the war, a desperation triggered by the stalemate the assassination caused, forced engineers to turn them into predators. They figured out how to sink a machine gun with a propeller so they could fire through the blades without blowing their own noses off. They built massive zeppelins to drop bombs on London, bringing war to civilians for the first time. By the end of the war, the blueprints were being laid for long-range bombers. The shot took us from the Wright brothers to the doorstep of the space age in a single decade. The chemical abyss. Perhaps the darkest technological leap was in the lab. Before the war, chemistry was used for medicine and fertilizer. After the shot, scientists like Fritz Haber, a man who ironically won a Nobel Prize for helping feed the world, turned their genius toward poison gas. Chlorine, phosgene, and the dreaded mustard gas were unleashed. It was a new kind of horror, a weapon you couldn't hide from, a weapon that turned the very air you breathed into a killer. This was the birth of modern chemical warfare. It forced every soldier to carry a gas mask, turning the human face into a terrifying, bug-eyed monster. It was the moment humanity realized that our progress outpaced our morality. The road to the atom. The most terrifying technological line starts at Sarajevo and ends at Hiroshima. The Great War accelerated the study of physics and energy. The same industrial scale required to build millions of artillery shells was later applied to the Manhattan Project. The scientists who developed the nuclear bomb in the 1940s were the children of the Great War. They saw how total war worked. They saw that in the world Gavrilo Princip created, there was no longer a line between a soldier and a civilian. The shot taught the world that if you want to win, you must be willing to destroy everything. The nuclear Cold War that dominated the late 20th century was simply the final frozen stage of the fire that started in 1914. The mechanical legacy. Today, when you drive a car, fly in a plane, or use GPS, which relies on satellite technology born from rocket science, you are using technology that was force-bred in the blood of the Great War. The shot that changed a continent acted as a violent catalyst. It took a slow-moving traditional world and strapped it to a rocket engine. We got the modern world, our medicine, our travel, our communication, but we got it because we spent 4 years trying to find the most efficient way to kill each other. We are the children of a mechanical revolution that was fueled by a 19-year-old bullet. Often feel like permanent lines on a map, as solid as the coastlines. But after the shot, the map of the world became a piece of scrap paper that was torn up and glued back together by men who had never visited the lands they were dividing. This chapter is about the ghost borders, lines drawn in 1919 that are still causing wars in the 21st century. The Ukrainian cauldron. Perhaps the most relevant ghost today is Ukraine. Before the shot in Sarajevo, Ukraine was split between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The war turned Ukraine into a scorched earth battlefield for 4 years. When the empires collapsed in 1917 and 1918, Ukraine briefly declared independence, but the chaos unleashed by the assassination, the Russian Revolution, and the Polish-Soviet War swallowed that dream. The borders of Ukraine were shifted, traded, and finally locked into the Soviet Union. The current conflict in Eastern Europe is, in many ways, the final chapter of the collapse of the empires that began in 1914. We are still arguing over where the Russian Empire ends and the modern world begins. The Polish Resurrection. For 123 years before the shot, the country of Poland didn't exist on a map. It had been carved up by Germany, Russia, and Austria.
The death of Franz Ferdinand was the miracle the Polish nationalists had prayed for. By killing the Archduke, Gavrilo Princip inadvertently set off a chain reaction that destroyed all three of Poland's occupiers. In 1918, Poland literally rose from the grave. But there was a catch. The victors gave Poland a corridor to the sea, which cut Germany in half. This single line on a map became Hitler's primary excuse for starting World War II 20 years later. The shot gave Poland its life, but it also placed a target on its back. The tragedy of Yugoslavia. Gavrilo Princip's dream was the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later known as Yugoslavia. He wanted all southern Slavs under one roof. The shot made this dream a reality in 1918, but it was a forced marriage. The people in this new country had different religions, different alphabets, and had spent the war fighting on opposite sides. The Serbs had fought for the Allies. The Croats had fought for the Austrians. By smashing them together into one country, the shot created a pressure cooker. When that cooker finally exploded in the 1990s, it resulted in the worst genocides in Europe since the Holocaust. Princip wanted to unite his people. Instead, he entrapped them in a century of ethnic tension. The mandates of the Middle East. If you want to know why the Middle East is in a state of constant upheaval, look at the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. While millions were dying in the trenches, British and French diplomats drew lines through the Ottoman Empire. They created Iraq by lumping together three different ethnic groups that didn't get along. They created Syria and Lebanon as French playgrounds. They made promises to Jewish Zionists and Arab nationalists for the same piece of land, Palestine, setting the stage for a conflict that has lasted over 75 years. Every time you hear about a crisis in Baghdad, Damascus, or Jerusalem, you are hearing the echo of the Ottoman collapse, a collapse that was put into high gear by the bullet that hit Franz Ferdinand's jugular vein. The map is still bleeding. The shot that changed a continent didn't just change the names of countries, it created minority problems. By drawing new borders, millions of people suddenly found themselves living in the wrong country. Germans were suddenly in Poland. Hungarians were suddenly in Romania. Russians were suddenly in Ukraine. This created a century of ethnic cleansing. The idea that a country should belong to only one ethnic group is a poisonous idea that gained strength from the ruins of the multi-ethnic empires. The Archduke wanted a world where different people lived together under one crown. Princip wanted a world of pure national states. Princip won the battle, but the world lost the peace. Before 1914, the City of London was the beating heart of the global economy. The British pound was as good as gold, and Europe was the world's greatest creditor. If you were a developing nation, including the United States, you went to Europe to borrow money. But the shot didn't just spill royal blood, it drained the world's gold reserves. This chapter is about how the Sarajevo assassination shifted the financial center of gravity across the Atlantic, turning the United States from a struggling debtor into the world's ultimate superpower. The cost of a bullet. When the war began, the great powers thought it would be a short, sharp conflict. They hadn't saved enough money for a long war. By 1915, they were burning through cash at a rate never seen in human history. To buy shells, trucks, and grain, the British and French turned to the only industrial giant not yet in the fight, the United States. Wall Street, led by figures like J.P. Morgan, began lending billions to the Allies. For the first 3 years of the war, the U.S. was essentially the factory and the bank for the war effort. The shot was the greatest economic stimulus package in American history. It pulled the U.S. out of a recession and started a manufacturing boom that would last for decades. The Great Reversal.
By 1917, the roles had completely flipped. Britain, once the wealthiest nation on earth, was nearly bankrupt. They had sold off their American investments and spent their gold. When the U.S. finally entered the war, it wasn't just sending soldiers, it was sending Liberty bonds. The American government began lending money directly to its European allies. By the time the armistice was signed, Europe owed the United States over $10 billion, nearly $200 billion in today's money. The world's bank vault had moved from London to New York City. The American century was bought with the debt of a dying Europe. The inflation nightmare. Because Germany and Austria couldn't borrow money from the U.S., they did something far more dangerous. They started printing it. After the war, this led to hyperinflation. In 1923 Germany, a loaf of bread that cost 200 marks in the morning could cost 200,000 marks by the evening. People were taking wheelbarrows full of cash to the grocery store. This economic chaos, a direct ripple effect of the war sparked in Sarajevo, is what destroyed the German middle class. It made them desperate, angry, and willing to listen to a radical named Adolf Hitler, who promised to burn the corrupt financial system to the ground. The death of the gold standard. Before the shot, the world's currencies were tied to gold, which kept prices stable and prevented governments from spending money they didn't have. But the total war triggered by the assassination forced every country to abandon the gold standard so they could print money to pay for more cannons. The world never truly went back. The shot gave birth to the modern era of fiat currency, money backed by government promises rather than precious metals. It allowed for massive government spending, but it also opened a door for the global financial crashes of 1929 and 2008. The shadow of debt. The shock that changed a continent created a cycle of debt that lasted almost a century. Germany only finished paying off its World War I reparations in 2010. Britain only finished paying her war debts to the U.S. and Canada in 2006. Think about that. Almost 100 years after Gavrilo Princip pulled the trigger, taxpayers were still paying for the shells that were fired because of him. The shot didn't just change the map, it mortgaged the future of the entire planet. America's position as the global reserve currency, the reason the U.S. dollar is the most powerful tool in the world today, is a direct result of the financial suicide Europe committed in 1914.
Or Berlin in the spring of 1914, you would have seen a world frozen in time. Society was a rigid pyramid. At the top were the aristocrats, men with titles and vast estates who believed they were born to lead. At the bottom were the working poor who lived in the shadows. Women had no vote, workers had few rights, and the social contract was a one-way street. But the shot in Sarajevo acted like a sledgehammer. By forcing entire nations into total war, it didn't just kill people, it killed the old social order. The great leveler, the trench. Before 1914, the upper classes believed they were physically and morally superior, but the machine gun didn't care about titles. In the mud of the Western Front, the son of a duke and the son of a coal miner bled the same color. They ate the same rotting food, caught the same lice, and died in the same craters. For the first time in history, the classes were forced to live together. When the war ended, the working-class survivors returned home with a new realization. If I am good enough to die for my country, I am good enough to have a say in how it's run. The shot gave the common man a sense of worth that the kings could never take back. The liberation of women. Perhaps the most dramatic change happened away from the front lines. When millions of men marched off to the trenches, the factories and farms of the world stopped. The empires were facing starvation and a shortage of shells. They had no choice but to turn to the one group they had ignored for centuries: women. Women flooded into munitions factories, became bus drivers, firefighters, and police officers. They handled heavy machinery, managed finances, and kept the heart of the continent beating. They realized they didn't need protection from men. They realized they were just as capable, if not more so, than the men who had excluded them. When the war ended, the governments of the US, Britain, and Germany couldn't tell these women to go back to the kitchen without a fight. The suffrage movement, the right to vote, gained unstoppable momentum because of the war. In the US, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920, largely as a thank you for women's service during the conflict. The bullet that killed the Archduke inadvertently broke the chains of half the human population. The death of the servant class. Before the shot, the wealthy lived in massive houses staffed by dozens of servants. Being a maid or a butler was the only option for millions. But the war opened up new jobs in factories and offices. Once a girl had earned a decent wage making shells or typing letters, she wasn't going back to scrubbing floors for pennies. The servant class vanished almost overnight. The great estates of Europe began to crumble because there was no one left to clean them. This shifted the economy toward the middle class, people who worked for themselves, lived in smaller homes, and bought the new consumer goods like radios and cars that the war tech had made possible. The radicalization of labor. Because the shot made the war so long and so industrial, the workers became the most important people in the country. If the coal miners went on strike, the Navy stopped moving. If the rail workers stopped, the soldiers starved. This gave rise to powerful labor unions. In the years following the war, we saw a massive wave of strikes and protests across the US and Europe. People were no longer afraid of their betters. The shot had shown them that the great men of history were capable of massive, bloody mistakes, and the working class was no longer willing to pay the price in silence. The cultural reset. Everything about the way we live today, from the fact that we don't have kings, to the way we dress, simpler, more functional clothing born from war rationing, to the way we view authority, is a result of this social earthquake. Gavrilo Princip thought he was just killing an heir to a throne. He didn't realize he was killing a way of life. He destroyed the age of elegance and replaced it with the age of the people. The world became more dangerous, yes, but it also became more equal. The rigid pyramid of 1914 was flattened into the broad, messy, and loud democracy of the modern era. If you stepped into a hospital in 1913, you were stepping back into the Dark Ages. Antibiotics didn't exist. If you had a deep wound in your leg, the solution was usually a saw and a prayer. Doctors didn't understand how to store blood, and reconstructive surgery was something out of a horror novel. But the shot in Sarajevo created a medical crisis so vast and so urgent that it forced a century of healing into 4 years. The millions of broken bodies coming out of the trenches became the laboratory for the medicine you rely on today. The invention of the blood bank. Before the war, blood transfusions were a person-to-person gamble. You had to hook the donor directly to the patient, and if the blood clotted or was the wrong type, both could die. The carnage of 1914 made this impossible. Surgeons needed blood on the move. An American doctor named Oswald Robertson realized that by adding sodium citrate to blood, he could stop it from clotting and keep it on ice. This was the birth of the blood bank. The first blood depots were established behind the lines of the Western Front. Every time you see a Red Cross blood drive or a life-saving transfusion in a US ER today, you are seeing a technology that was perfected to save soldiers who were dying because of a teenager's bullet. The faces of tin. Plastic surgery. The shot introduced a new kind of injury, high-velocity shrapnel. Unlike a clean bullet hole, shrapnel tore faces apart. Thousands of men returned home with no noses, no jaws, and shattered eyes. They were called the men with broken faces, and they were so terrifying to look at that some were forced to live in separate colonies. A surgeon named Harold Gillies was horrified by this. He pioneered the tubed pedicle, taking skin from the chest or arm and walking it up to the face while keeping the blood supply attached. He wasn't just fixing wounds, he was trying to restore the human identity. This was the foundation of modern plastic surgery. The techniques used today for everything from car accident recovery to cosmetic procedures were born from the desperate need to put human faces back together in the wake of Sarajevo. The X-ray on the move. In 1914, X-ray machines were massive, heavy objects found only in city hospitals. When a soldier was hit by a bullet, doctors had to poke around the wound with their fingers to find the lead, a process that almost always caused a fatal infection. Marie Curie, the famous scientist, decided to change this. She invented petite curies, small trucks equipped with X-ray machines and generators. She drove them to the front lines herself, training technicians to see inside the human body without cutting it open. This turned the X-ray from a laboratory curiosity into a standard tool of emergency medicine. It set the stage for the portable medical tech we see in modern ambulances and battlefield clinics. The battle against infection, the Carrel-Dakin method. Long before penicillin, the biggest killer wasn't the bullet, it was the bacteria. A minor scratch in a muddy trench could lead to gangrene and death within days. Two men, Alexis Carrel and Henry Dakin, developed a system of flushing deep wounds with a specific antiseptic solution before closing them. It was the first time doctors used a systematic, chemical approach to fighting infection in trauma. It laid the groundwork for the antiseptic protocols used in every operating room in the world today. The triage system. When hundreds of men were carried off the battlefield at once, doctors didn't know who to treat first. It was chaos. Out of this desperation, the military perfected the triage system, the system of categorizing patients based on the urgency of their wounds: red, yellow, green. This system is the backbone of every modern emergency room in America today. When you go to the ER today and a nurse checks your vitals to decide how fast you see a doctor, you are participating in a system designed to manage the mass casualties of the war Gavrilo Princip started. The final paradox. It is the ultimate irony of the shot. The most violent event in human history led to the greatest advancements in saving lives. To counter the industrialization of death, we had to create the industrialization of healing. We learned more about the human body by trying to put it back together than we ever did when it was whole. We are a healthier, longer-lived species today because we spent 4 years learning how to survive the nightmare that began in Sarajevo. Before the shot, spying was considered ungentlemanly. In the 19th century, most countries only had a handful of intelligence officers, usually aristocrats who spoke many languages and hung around parties. But the moment the bullet hit the Archduke, the world realized that information was more valuable than gold or bullets. The shot triggered a secret evolution that transformed small spy rings into massive global intelligence networks we know today: the CIA, MI6, and the NSA. The code breakers in Room 40. In 1914, communication moved via telegraph and radio. The Germans used a complex cipher to send orders to their ships and embassies. The British
desperate to know what the blank check really meant, created a top-secret group in a place called Room 40. These weren't soldiers. They were math professors, crossword puzzle experts, and linguists. They were the world's first hackers. Their greatest achievement was intercepting the Zimmermann telegram, the secret German message to Mexico. By cracking this code, they gave President Woodrow Wilson the smoking gun he needed to bring the U.S. into the war. This success directly led to the creation of GCHQ in Britain and the NSA in America. The shot taught the world that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's a decrypted sentence. The birth of the human intelligence, HUMINT. Because the war was a stalemate, the empires couldn't win on the front lines. They had to win from within. The British sent a young officer named T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, into the desert to organize an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. At the same time, the Germans sent a sealed train across Europe carrying a radical named Vladimir Lenin back to Russia, hoping he would start a revolution and knock Russia out of the war. These were covert operations, the first time states used covert subversion to topple empires. This is the exact playbook the CIA and the KGB would use throughout the entire Cold War. The Black Hand and the security state. The fact that a 19-year-old student could walk up to an archduke and kill him was the greatest security failure in history. It changed the way leaders were protected. Before the shot, kings and presidents often walked among the people with minimal guards. After 1914, the Secret Service model became the standard. The world entered an age of internal security. Governments began issuing passports, monitoring suspicious foreigners, and creating files on political radicals. The Sarajevo assassination was the 9/11 of 1914. It created a permanent state of paranoia that led to the heavy surveillance societies we live in today. The woman who changed the game, Marthe Knockert. Espionage was no longer just for men. Women became some of the most effective spies of the Great War. Marthe Knockert, a nurse working in a German-occupied hospital, used her position to gather intelligence for the British. She blew up a German ammunition dump and smuggled secrets across the lines. The shot proved that anyone, a nurse, a waiter, a student, could be a soldier in the invisible war. It democratized spying and made it a total war activity. The legacy, the world of eyes everywhere. When you look at the modern world, the satellite surveillance, the encrypted messaging apps, the special ops teams, you are looking at a system that was built because of a failure in Sarajevo. The shot proved that the world was too connected and too dangerous to leave to chance. We built the intelligence state to prevent another 1914, but in doing so, we created a world where privacy vanished. The shadow of Gavrilo Princip's pistol is what created the deep state that modern politicians still argue about. We are constantly searching for the next shot before it is fired, a cycle of suspicion that has no end.
We talk about people, maps, and money, but the bullet that hit Franz Ferdinand also tore a hole in the physical biology of our planet. This chapter is about the iron harvest, the literal poisoning of the European continent, and how the carnage of 1914 birthed the modern environmental movement. The landscape of the moon. Before 1914, the border between France and Germany was a lush paradise of ancient forests, rolling hills, and pristine farmland. The shot turned it into a lunar wasteland. Because the war became a stalemate, the two sides fired over 1.5 billion artillery shells at each other. The earth was churned so many times that the topsoil, the life-giving layer of the planet, simply vanished. Forests were reduced to blackened, splintered toothpicks. This wasn't just damage, it was ecocide. For the first time, human conflict was capable of deleting a landscape. Today, there are parts of France known as the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, areas so saturated with unexploded shells and arsenic that they are legally uninhabitable, even 110 years later. The Iron Harvest. Every year, French and Belgian farmers still plow up hundreds of tons of unexploded metal. They call it the Iron Harvest. The shot left a permanent layer of lead, steel, and mercury in the crust of the earth. Scientists can actually detect the year 1914 in the soil layers because of the sudden spike in heavy metals. The Sarajevo assassination didn't just change history, it changed the geology of Europe. We left a signature of death in the dirt that will remain for thousands of years. The chemical poisoning. The gas warfare mentioned in earlier chapters didn't just burn lungs, it killed the earth. Mustard gas and chlorine settled into the groundwater. In certain areas of the former Western Front, the soil contains arsenic levels 10,000 times higher than normal. This taught humanity a terrifying lesson. What we do to the earth does back to us. Soldiers who survived the gas often found that the water they drank from nearby wells was poisoned for years. This realization led to the first international discussions about environmental responsibility in war. The shot proved that our weapons had become too powerful for the planet to absorb. The birth of the wilderness movement. Paradoxically, the shot also led to a new appreciation for nature. Soldiers trapped in the mud and blood of the trenches wrote thousands of poems about the return of the birds or the blooming of a single poppy in no man's land. The poppy became the symbol of the war because it was the only thing that could grow in the churned, lime-rich soil of the graves. This deep emotional connection to the resilience of nature sparked a movement to protect wild spaces. In the US and Europe, the post-war era saw a surge in creation of national parks and wildlife preserves. We realized that if we could destroy the world so easily, we had a moral obligation to save what was left. The industrialization of food. Before 1914, the world's population was limited by how much manure we could find to grow crops. The shot accelerated the need for mass-produced food. Today, nearly half the people on Earth are alive only because of this synthetic fertilizer. But this came at a cost. The massive runoff of these chemicals has created dead zones in our oceans. Our entire modern food system and the environmental crisis it causes is a direct descendant of the supply chain panic of the Great War. The lasting shadow. The shot that changed a continent taught us that the environment is not a passive backdrop to history, it is a victim of it. When Gavrilo Princip pulled that trigger, he didn't just start a war between nations, he started a war against the biosphere. We are still living in a world that is chemically and geologically scarred by the events of 1914. Every time you hear about soil contamination or the carbon footprint of modern militaries, you are hearing the echo of the explosions that started in Sarajevo. If you look at the top-grossing movies in the US today, they are filled with two things: superheroes and post-apocalyptic wastelands. These aren't just random trends, they are the direct cultural descendants of the shot in Sarajevo. Before 1914, children's stories were about fairies, talking animals, or noble knights in shining armor. But the shot destroyed the idea that a knight could save the world. It created a world so dark and so mechanical that we had to invent a new kind of mythology to survive it. The invention of the superhero. The carnage of the Great War left millions of people feeling powerless. One man with a gun had started a war that killed 20 million, and no single person seemed able to stop it. This sense of powerlessness is what birthed the modern superhero. In the 1930s, as the world watched the second act of the Sarajevo crisis, the rise of the Nazis, begin,
two Jewish Americans created Superman. He wasn't just a hero, he was the man of tomorrow. He was faster than a speeding bullet, the very bullet that killed the Archduke. He was a symbol of an individual who could stand up to the industrial machines of war and say no. The entire multi-billion-dollar comic book industry exists because the world needed a fantasy of strength to counter the reality of the Sarajevo failure. The birth of science fiction, sci-fi. Before the shot, writers like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne wrote about science romances, but after 1914, science wasn't romantic anymore, it was terrifying. The shot gave us the dystopian novel. Books like Brave New World and 1984 weren't just imaginative stories, they were warnings about the total state that was born in the trenches of World War I. The post-apocalyptic genre, think Mad Max or The Last of Us, is essentially a reimagining of No Man's Land. That wasteland of mud, gas, and ruins became a permanent fixture in our collective imagination. We are still obsessed with the end of the world because we actually saw it happen in 1914. The rise of the cinema as a weapon. Before the shot, movies were 5-minute novelties of trains arriving at stations, but the war forced the development of the feature film. Governments realized they could use movies to manipulate the masses, propaganda. But more importantly, the public needed an escape. In the U.S., Hollywood exploded in the 1920s because people wanted to forget the shot. They wanted the jazz age, the glamour, and the fantasy. Hollywood became the world's dream factory as a direct response to the nightmare of the European battlefield. The U.S. entertainment industry is the largest in the world today because it was the only one that survived the shot with its resources intact. The death of the gentleman and the rise of cool. Before 1914, the ideal man was the Victorian gentleman, stiff, formal, and obedient. The shot killed him. In his place came the cynical rebel. Think of James Bond, Indiana Jones, or even modern action stars. They are all lone wolves who don't trust the government, don't follow the rules, and use violence to solve problems. This cool archetype was born in the disillusionment of the post-Sarajevo world. We stopped trusting the kings and generals and started cheering for the guy who breaks the rules to get the job done. The global village of entertainment. Because the shot dragged every continent into the same war, it created the first truly global culture. For the first time, a person in New York, a soldier in India, and a nurse in France were all watching the same Charlie Chaplin movies and listening to the same jazz records to cope with the stress of the war. The shot standardized our tastes. It created the global audience. Every time you watch a viral video or a global blockbuster today, you are participating in a cultural network that was forced together by the shared trauma of 1914. The final lesson. The shot that changed a continent didn't just rewrite our history books, it wrote our movie scripts. It taught us that the world is fragile, that science can be a monster, and that we need heroes, even if they are only on a screen, to help us make sense of the chaos. Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots, but he created 1,000 stories. Our modern culture is the armor we wear to protect ourselves from the memory of that day in Sarajevo.
We have reached the end of the line. We have traveled from a sun-drenched street corner in Bosnia to the moon, the atom, and the digital world of today. We have seen how a single flawed teenager with a heavy pistol acted as the Big Bang for the modern world. But there is one final question to answer. What does the shot mean for us right now in the 21st century? The fragility of the just-in-time world. In 1914, the world was more connected than it had ever been. You could take a train from London to Constantinople with no passport. Global trade was booming. People thought a world war was impossible because it would be too expensive and bad for business. The shot proved them wrong. It showed that emotions, nationalism, and accidental escalations are more powerful than bank accounts. Today, we live in a world of just-in-time supply chains and instant digital connections. We think we are safe because we are connected. Sarajevo is a permanent warning that the more connected a system is, the faster the fire spreads. If the internet had existed in 1914, the war would have started in minutes, not weeks. The Prince Principle. The most haunting legacy of the story is the realization that the small can topple the great. Before the shot, history was written by empires. After the shot, history became the playground of the radical individual. A lone hacker can take down a national power grid. A single viral video can topple a government. A lone gunman can still pivot the trajectory of a superpower. We call this the Prince Principle. In a highly complex, interconnected world, a single person at the right place at the wrong time with the right weapon can change the fate of 8 billion people. The responsibility of memory. When you visit the site of the assassination today, you won't find a grand monument to Gavrilo Prince. You will find a quiet street corner and a museum that tries to explain the unexplainable. For a U.S. audience, the lesson isn't just about European history, it's a lesson about vigilance. We live in the long 1914. The tensions we see in Eastern Europe today, the friction in the Middle East, and the rise of new global rivalries are all part of the same unfinished business. The shot reminds us that peace is not a natural state. It is a fragile glass structure that must be guarded every single day. The last echo. As we close this narrative, imagine the smoke rising from that Browning .38 one last time. In that puff of smoke were the lives of 20 million soldiers, the rise of the Soviet Union, the horror of the Holocaust, the birth of the United States as a superpower, and the very smartphone you might be using to read this. Gavrilo Prince died in a cold prison cell in 1918, coughing from tuberculosis just months before the war ended. He never saw the world he created. He never knew that he was the father of the 20th century. We are his unintended heirs. We live in the cracks of the world he broke, and our only hope of not repeating his mistake is to remember that every wrong turn has a consequence, and every shot has an echo that never truly stops. While the bullets from the shot were still flying across the trenches, a new invisible enemy was born from the chaos of the war. To truly understand the scale of the disaster Gavrilo Prince unleashed, we have to talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu. This wasn't a separate event. It was a direct biological consequence of the war that the shot started. It killed more people than the war itself, and it changed the way the human race survives on a biological level. The war as a super spreader. In a normal world, a deadly flu strain might burn out in a small village, but because of the shot, the world was in constant motion. The trenches, millions of men were packed into damp, cold, unsanitary trenches with weakened immune systems. This was the perfect evolutionary lab for a virus to become more lethal. The troop ships. Just as the shot turned the U.S. into a global power, U.S. troop ships became floating petri dishes, carrying the virus from Kansas to the ports of France. The celebration. When the war ended, millions of people flooded the streets of London, New York, and Paris to celebrate. These victory parades became the greatest super-spreader events in human history. The death of the young and strong. Most flu strains kill the elderly and the very young, but the 1918 flu, mutated by the conditions of the Great War, targeted the young and healthy. It triggered a cytokine storm, turning the body's own immune system against itself. An entire generation that had survived the machine guns of the Western Front returned home only to be killed by a cough.
In the US alone, the life expectancy dropped by 12 years in a single year. The shot didn't just kill the Archduke, it accidentally triggered a biological weapon that killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. The birth of global public health. Before this pandemic, public health was a local issue, but the global scale of the 1918 disaster, fueled by the global nature of the war, led to the creation of modern public health systems. Centralized health ministries. Countries realized they needed a national department to track and fight disease. The WHO precursor, the League of Nations, created to stop another Sarajevo, formed the Health Organization, which eventually became the World Health Organization. Epidemiology, the science of tracking how diseases move through populations, became a top priority for national security. The shot and the mask. If you look at photos from 1918, you see people in San Francisco and London wearing gauze masks. You see schools closed and businesses shuttered. The shot in Sarajevo forced humanity to learn the rules of social distancing and quarantining on a massive scale for the first time. The debates we had during the COVID pandemic about masks, government overreach, and vaccine science are the exact same debates that began in the shadow of the Great War. The final biological tally. The Sarajevo assassination was meant to free a small group of people in the Balkans. Instead, it moved the entire human population into a new era of biological vulnerability. It proved that in an interconnected world, a war in one corner of the map can lead to a funeral in every home on the planet. We are the survivors of a century defined by the shot. We carry the antibodies, the medical systems, and the psychological fears of a world that learned the hard way that everything is connected.
We have traveled from a sun-drenched street corner in Bosnia to the moon, the atom, and the digital world of today. We have seen how a single flawed teenager with a heavy pistol acted as the Big Bang for the modern world. But there is one final question to answer. What does the shot mean for us right now in the 21st century? The fragility of the just-in-time world. In 1914, the world was more connected than it had ever been. You could take a train from London to Constantinople with no passport. Global trade was booming. People thought a world war was impossible because it would be too expensive and bad for business. The shot proved them wrong. It showed that emotions, nationalism, and accidental escalations are more powerful than bank accounts. Today, we live in a world of just-in-time supply chains and instant digital connections. We think we are safe because we are connected. Sarajevo is a permanent warning that the more connected a system is, the faster the fire spreads. If the internet had existed in 1914, the war would have started in minutes, not weeks. The Prince Principle. The most haunting legacy of the story is the realization that the small can topple the great. Before the shot, history was written by empires. After the shot, history became the playground of the radical individual. A lone hacker can take down a national power grid. A single viral video can topple a government. A lone gunman can still pivot the trajectory of a superpower. We call this the Prince Principle. In a highly complex, interconnected world, a single person at the right place at the wrong time with the right weapon can change the fate of 8 billion people. The responsibility of memory. When you visit the site of the assassination today, you won't find a grand monument to Gavrilo Prince. You will find a quiet street corner and a museum that tries to explain the unexplainable. For a U.S. audience, the lesson isn't just about European history, it's a lesson about vigilance. We live in the long 1914. The tensions we see in Eastern Europe today, the friction in the Middle East, and the rise of new global rivalries are all part of the same unfinished business. The shot reminds us that peace is not a natural state. It is a fragile glass structure that must be guarded every single day. The last echo. As we close this narrative, imagine the smoke rising from that Browning .38 one last time. In that puff of smoke were the lives of 20 million soldiers, the rise of the Soviet Union, the horror of the Holocaust, the birth of the United States as a superpower, and the very smartphone you might be using to read this. Gavrilo Princip died in a cold prison cell in 1918, coughing from tuberculosis just months before the war ended. He never saw the world he created. He never knew that he was the father of the 20th century. We are his unintended heirs. We live in the cracks of the world he broke. And our only hope of not repeating his mistake is to remember that every wrong turn has a consequence, and every shot has an echo that never truly stops. While the bullets from the shot were still flying across the trenches, a new invisible enemy was born from the chaos of the war. To truly understand the scale of the disaster Gavrilo Princip unleashed, we have to talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu. This wasn't a separate event. It was a direct biological consequence of the war that the shot started. It killed more people than the war itself, and it changed the way the human race survives on a biological level. The war as a super spreader. In a normal world, a deadly flu strain might burn out in a small village, but because of the shot, the world was in constant motion. The trenches, millions of men were packed into damp, cold, unsanitary trenches with weakened immune systems. This was the perfect evolutionary lab for a virus to become more lethal. The troop ships. Just as the shot turned the U.S. into a global power, U.S. troop ships became floating petri dishes, carrying the virus from Kansas to the ports of France. The celebration. When the war ended, millions of people flooded the streets of London, New York, and Paris to celebrate. These victory parades became the greatest super-spreader events in human history. The death of the young and strong. Most flu strains kill the elderly and the very young, but the 1918 flu, mutated by the conditions of the Great War, targeted the young and healthy. It triggered a cytokine storm, turning the body's own immune system against itself. An entire generation that had survived the machine guns of the Western Front returned home only to be killed by a cough. In the U.S. alone, the life expectancy dropped by 12 years in a single year. The shot didn't just kill the Archduke, it accidentally triggered a biological weapon that killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. The birth of global public health. Before this pandemic, public health was a local issue, but the global scale of the 1918 disaster, fueled by the global nature of the war, led to the creation of modern public health systems. Centralized health ministries. Countries realized they needed a national department to track and fight disease. The WHO precursor, the League of Nations, created to stop another Sarajevo, formed the Health Organization, which eventually became the World Health Organization. Epidemiology, the science of tracking how diseases move through populations, became a top priority for national security. The shot and the mask. If you look at photos from 1918, you see people in San Francisco and London wearing gauze masks. You see schools closed and businesses shuttered. The shot in Sarajevo forced humanity to learn the rules of social distancing and quarantining on a massive scale for the first time. The debates we had during the COVID pandemic about masks, government overreach, and vaccine science are the exact same debates that began in the shadow of the Great War. The final biological tally. The Sarajevo assassination was meant to free a small group of people in the Balkans. Instead, it moved the entire human population into a new era of biological vulnerability. It proved that in an interconnected world, a war in one corner of the map can lead to a funeral in every home on the planet. We are the survivors of a century defined by the shot. We carry the antibodies, the medical systems, and the psychological fears of a world that learned the hard way that everything is connected. The world followed a code of civilized warfare. There were rules, even in battle. You didn't target civilians. You didn't use poison. You didn't execute prisoners without a trial. There was a belief that even in war, humanity possessed a moral compass. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand didn't just break the peace, it broke the compass. Because the war became so long, so expensive, and so desperate, the leaders of the world decided that the end justified any means. This chapter is about the death of old world honor and the birth of total morality. The logic of the trench. In 1914, soldiers went to war with a sense of chivalry. By 1916, they were living in holes in the ground like animals. When you are starving, covered in lice, and watching your friends die by the thousands, your sense of right and wrong changes. This led to the normalization of atrocity. The first gas attack, when Germany unleashed chlorine gas at Ypres, the world was horrified, but within months, everyone was doing it. The moral red line simply vanished. Unrestricted submarine warfare. Before the shot, it was considered murder to sink a merchant ship without warning the crew. By 1917, German U-boats were sinking everything in sight. The ocean became a lawless graveyard. We call this moral creep. Once you do something evil to win, it becomes the new normal. This is why, in the modern world, we find it so hard to agree on international laws. We are still living in the shadow of the day the rules were thrown away. The greater good and the rise of extremism. Gavrilo Princip believed he was a good man because he was killing for a great cause, Serbian independence. This idea that a noble goal excuses a horrific crime became the dominant philosophy of the 20th century. Because the shot led to the collapse of stable empires, it left a vacuum filled with men who took Princip's logic to the extreme. Vladimir Lenin argued that a red terror was necessary to save the working class. Adolf Hitler argued that the total destruction of enemies was necessary to save the German race. The shot taught the world that you could murder your way to a utopia. This shattered the religious and philosophical foundations of the West. We moved from a world of "thou shalt not kill" to a world of "kill the right people for the right reason." The devaluation of life, the numbers game. Before 1914, the death of a single person, like an archduke, was a global tragedy. After 4 years of war, death became a statistic. Generals sat in chateaus and traded 50,000 lives for 100 yards of mud. This industrialization of death changed how governments viewed their citizens. People became human material. This mindset is what allowed for the genocides and mass starvations that followed in the decades after the war. If you can justify losing 1 million men in a trench, you can justify almost anything. We still struggle with this in modern politics. When we talk about collateral damage or acceptable losses, we are using the cold, heartless language invented in the wake of Sarajevo. The numb generation. The shot created a world of cynicism. The survivors of the war, the lost generation, returned home feeling that all the big words, honor, glory, patriotism, were lies used by old men to get young men killed. This led to a moral vacuum. If nothing is sacred, then anything is permitted. This is why the 1920s and 30s were so chaotic. Without a shared sense of right and wrong, the only thing that mattered was power. The shot didn't just kill an archduke, it killed the idea that humanity was getting better or kinder. It revealed the predator underneath the tuxedo. The final reckoning. Today, we live in a world of gray morality. We have precision strikes, shadow wars, and algorithmic warfare. We try to be ethical, but we are still using the tools and the logic of the total war that Princip started. The lesson of the shot is that once you let the monster out of the cage, you can never quite put it back. We are still trying to find our moral compass in the mud of a trench that was dug over 100 years ago. We are trying to prove that a single life does matter, even though our history says otherwise. When Gavrilo Princip pulled the trigger in a dusty corner of the Balkans, he didn't just collapse Europe. He accidentally set off a series of explosions that traveled across the Silk Road and leveled the 2,000-year-old imperial system of China. To a U.S. audience, the rise of China often feels like a modern overnight success story. But the blueprint for the modern Chinese superpower was drafted in the blood of the Great War. Without the shot, the China we see today, the tech giant, the military rival, the manufacturing engine, simply wouldn't exist. The greater betrayal, the Treaty of Versailles. Before 1914, China was being carved up like a cake by European powers. When the war started, China saw an opportunity. They sent 140,000 workers, the Chinese Labor Corps, to the Western Front to dig trenches and repair tanks for the Allies. They believed that by helping defeat Germany, they would earn their respect and get their stolen land back. But at the peace conference in 1919, the Western powers, exhausted and cynical from the war the shot had started, betrayed China. Instead of giving Chinese land back to Chinese, they gave it to Japan as a reward. The May 4th movement. When news of this betrayal hit Beijing, the country exploded. On May 4th, 1919, students flooded the streets. This wasn't just a protest, it was a psychological break. They realized that Western democracy was a lie. They realized that international law only applied to the strong. They decided that China needed a new, tougher philosophy to survive a world defined by the Sarajevo violence. The birth of the CCP. In the crowd of those angry 1919 protesters was a young library assistant named Mao Zedong. The disillusionment caused by the shot drove Chinese intellectuals away from Western liberalism and straight into the arms of the new Soviet Union, which, as we know, was another direct product of the war. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 as a direct response to the failed world order of 1914. The bullet that killed the Archduke in Bosnia provided the fuel for the revolution that would eventually change the lives of 1/5 of the human race. The Pacific powder keg. The shot also gave Japan its big break. With the European powers busy killing each other in the trenches, Japan had a free hand to expand its empire in the Pacific. They seized German colonies and built a massive navy. This created the Pacific powder keg. The friction between a rising Japan and a nervous United States, the friction that would eventually lead to Pearl Harbor, began because the shot removed the European police from the Asian theater. The war in the Pacific was essentially the third act of the Sarajevo tragedy. The shift of the global heart. For 500 years, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of the world. Because the shot caused Europe to commit civilizational suicide, the center of gravity began to shift. The shot forced the U.S. to look west and China to look inward. Today, when we talk about the pivot to Asia or the trade wars between Washington and Beijing, we are watching the final result of the power vacuum created in 1914. Europe lost its grip on the world that day, and the East began its long, painful, and ultimately successful climb to reclaim it. The final connection. It is one of history's greatest ironies. A Serbian nationalist kills an Austrian prince to save his small village, and in doing so, he clears the path for a communist revolution in China and the end of 400 years of Western global dominance. We often think of the shot as a European story. It isn't. It was the moment the old world died and the global world was born. The tensions in the South China Sea today are the ripples of a splash made in a Sarajevo river over 100 years ago. States was a giant, but it was a sleeping one. It was a nation of farmers, small-town merchants, and a military so small it was ranked 13th in the world, behind even Portugal. Most Americans couldn't have pointed to Sarajevo on a map, and they didn't want to. They followed George Washington's advice: avoid entangling alliances. The shot changed that forever. It didn't just pull the U.S. into a war, It forcibly reinvented the American identity. It turned the isolationist republic into the global policeman. The great arsenal is born. When the shot paralyzed European factories, the world turned to America. Suddenly, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the auto plants of Detroit, and the wheat fields of Kansas were feeding and arming the entire planet. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex. Before the shot, the U.S. government was small. After the shot, the government and big business shook hands in a partnership that has never ended. The U.S. learned that war is good business. This economic boom didn't just end a recession, it created the middle class and the American dream of the 1920s. We became a superpower by selling the tools of survival to a dying Europe. The federal growth spurt. When the shot paralyzed European factories, the U.S. government had to grow at a terrifying speed. The income tax, the 16th Amendment, had just been passed, but it was the war that made high income taxes a permanent reality for the American public to pay for the Liberty Bonds. Intelligence and policing. As we saw in the Intelligence State chapter, the FBI and federal surveillance agencies were born out of the fear of hyphenated Americans, German Americans, or Irish Americans who might have sympathies for the Old World conflict. The Wilsonian vision, democracy as a weapon. President Woodrow Wilson realized that the shot had destroyed the old way of doing things. He decided that if the U.S. was going to bleed in Europe, it had to be for a holy cause. He came up with the 14 points. This was the birth of American exceptionalism on a global scale. Wilson argued that the U.S. had a moral duty to make the world safe for democracy. This idea has driven every U.S. intervention since, from the Cold War to Iraq and Afghanistan. Before the shot, America was just a country. After the shot, America became an idea that it tried to export to every corner of the globe. The Great Migration and the Civil Rights spark. The shot even changed the racial map of the United States. When the war stopped the flow of European immigrants, northern factories faced a labor shortage. This triggered the Great Migration, millions of black Americans moving from the Jim Crow South to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Black soldiers went to France to fight for democracy and were treated as heroes by the French people. When they returned home to a country that still denied them basic rights, the spark of the civil rights movement was lit. They had seen a world without a color line, and they were never going to accept the old way again. The bullet in Sarajevo inadvertently started the clock on the American Civil Rights Revolution. The lasting burden of leadership. By 1919, the U.S. was the only unbroken power left. The shot had effectively handed the keys of the world to Washington, D.C., but the U.S. wasn't ready. The country retreated back into isolationism in the 1930s, a move that many historians argue allowed Hitler to rise and the sequel war to begin. The lesson the U.S. learned from the shot was that nature abhors a vacuum. If America doesn't lead, someone else, usually someone more dangerous, will. Every time you see a U.S. aircraft carrier in a foreign sea or a diplomat at a UN summit, you are seeing a nation that is still trying to manage the mess that began on June 28, 1914. We are the reluctant superpower, born in a Balkan street corner we never meant to visit. If any nation paid the ultimate price for the shot, it was Russia. In 1914, the Russian Empire was a massive, creaking giant. It was the land of the Tsars, a mystical, ancient autocracy where the emperor, Nicholas II, believed he was chosen by God to rule. The shot in Sarajevo was the spark that fell into the Russian powder keg. It didn't just cause a war, it triggered the most radical social experiment in human history, the birth of the Soviet Union. The Slavic trap. When the Archduke was killed, Russia felt it had no choice but to act. They saw themselves as the big brother to the Serbs. Nicholas II knew that if he let Austria-Hungary crush Serbia, he would look weak and his empire might crumble from within.
But Russia was not ready for a modern industrial war. They had millions of brave soldiers, but not enough boots, rifles, or even food. The shot forced a 19th century peasant army to fight a 20th century killing machine. By 1916, Russia had lost millions of men. The Holy Tsar was no longer seen as a god, he was seen as a butcher. The collapse of the crown. The war sparked by the shot drained Russia of everything. In the cities, people were starving. In the trenches, soldiers were deserting by the thousands. In February 1917, the pressure finally blew the lid off the can. A revolution forced the Tsar to abdicate his throne. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, one of the most powerful families in world history, was wiped out in the matter of days. This was the great collapse that Gavrilo Princip had hoped for, but on a scale he couldn't have imagined. The shot had decapitated the Russian Empire. Lenin and the sealed train. As Russia spiraled into chaos, the Germans realized they could use the shot one more time. They found a radical revolutionary living in exile in Switzerland named Vladimir Lenin. They put him on a sealed train and shipped him like a virus back into Russia. Their goal was simple: use Lenin to start a second revolution, knock Russia out of the war, and win in the West. It worked. In October 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power, promising bread, land, and peace. Russia signed a treaty with Germany and exited the war, but the cost was a brutal civil war that would kill millions more. The birth of the USSR. Out of the ashes of the war that began in Sarajevo, the Soviet Union was born. This was a new kind of state, one that didn't care about kings or traditions. It was based on the idea of world revolution. The shot had created a massive, nuclear-armed, eventually, rival to the Western world. For the next 70 years, the global map was divided between the capitalist West and the communist East. The Cold War, the space race, and the Cuban Missile Crisis are all direct biological offspring of the events of June 28, 1914. If the Archduke had lived, the Bolsheviks likely would have remained a fringe group in the shadows of history. The Romanov execution, a final echo. In July 1918, the Tsar and his entire family, including his 5 children, were taken into a basement and executed by Bolshevik firing squads. It was a cold, mechanical end to an era. The shot in Sarajevo had started with the death of one royal heir. It ended with the total extermination of a royal bloodline. The old world of kings and cousins was dead. In its place was a world of ideologies and iron. The Red Storm had arrived, and it would dominate the horizon of the 20th century until the very end.